Camille Barnett is the Chief Management Officer of the city where we are sitting, the District of Columbia. She's the CMO of the District of Columbia since the beginning of this year. She comes to us from the Greater Triangle Regional Council in North Carolina, and before that served with some distinction as the manager of the city of Austin. So for those of you who live in the area, you may have noticed that there was a lot of hue and cry and adulation and detraction and all sorts of, as we say in Brooklyn, mishigas about her arrival. And we'll hear from her first, because she actually has to go to a meeting where they're going to figure out how to run the city. Start with Camille Barnett.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's great to see people smiling. What I'd like to do is to talk first about the goal of what I think we're trying to create. Because cities in this country, like cities all over the world, really aren't cities anymore. What are actual cities are metropolitan regions. And I think that when I think about what it is we're trying to create, it's summarized in two words: a sustainable city-state. I like the word city-state for metropolitan region because it really talks about us living and working and being one indivisible unit as we go forward into the next century. Ray asked how we know when we have one of these things. Well, here's a short way for me to define what a sustainable city-state is, and it has to do with the 4 E's. If we're going to have a sustainable city-state, these places we call home have to have a strong economy, a clean environment, social equity, and civic engagement. As we talk about how to create American sustainable city-states, I think it's important for us to understand that this is a global challenge, not just a challenge for this country. Now over half of the world's population, for the first time in history, live in urban areas. By the year 2010, we'll have 26 cities over 10 million in population, 22 of which are in what we now call developing countries. The kinds of issues that we're trying to solve here are the same kinds of issues that are being addressed all over the globe. And I think one of the things that we need to do is to think about how we make these 4 E's work. If we're talking about the strong economy, we need to understand that global competition trumps our current political structures. We've got to find a new way of financing and governing these city-states if we're going to continue to have a competitive city-state in the global economy. When we talk about a clean environment, you'll hear lots of folks this morning talking about different ways of thinking about the places that we live in. Smedes York is a former mayor of Raleigh, and I love what he said about America. Americans are against 2 things: sprawl and density. And somehow we've got to come to terms with what we're doing with urban design, what we're doing with environmental justice, how we're doing our work with brownfields and place-based solutions to environmental problems, and really think about environment as something that is integral to a sustainable city-state. And then social equity. I think our challenges there are to address the growing gap between the rich and the poor, and the growing gap between the races, and concentrations of poverty, particularly among the races. As David Rusk has said in his work on cities, looking at this country, one of the crucial, in fact, the crucial index of whether a city-state or a city is sustainable is something he calls the disparity index, the ratio of per capita income between the central cities and the suburbs. You know, we don't even talk about this in terms of what we report when we talk about the health of cities. But it's important for us to address this disparity if we're going to have something that is sustainable. And lastly, civic engagement. When people lament the loss of community, what we're lamenting is the loss of our neighborhood and our sense of connection. It's as if we've developed cities that now all meet Gertrude Stein's statement, there is no there there. And for us to get the there back, for us to have the sense of connection and the sense of place, it requires us really and truly to get involved. We need to be able to think bigger and smaller at the same time, think by neighborhood and think by region, if we're going to govern ourselves locally with the kind of insight that will keep us sustainable. I think we've learned some lessons, and that is that none of these systems exist by accident. There are surely unintended consequences to public and private policies, but the systems exist and maintain the way they are because there's a vested interest in keeping them that way. So we need to look at systems not as accidents, and we need to look at the leverage points in those systems to be able to change what we're doing. Let me suggest a few. First of all, follow the money. Look at how we finance local governments, because our taxing and our subsidies make a big difference in how we develop and how we are competitive among jurisdictions in the same region rather than between and among regions. We need to look at transportation. There's a lot that will be discussed this morning about the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, or ICE-T, a federal policy that encourages regional action, but in many cases is still controlled by the same actors who allocate transportation monies in the same way. We also need to look at land use regulations, our spatial mismatch, our uniform zoning codes with cumulative and exclusionary zoning. These are generally in control of local governments and generally not looked at as levers for how we develop. We need to look at the proliferation of special districts, particularly utility districts, but also schools, fires, downtown public improvement districts, and others that fragment our accountability in our governmental systems. We also need to pay particular attention to state governments that govern much of the activities of cities in this country. And we need to understand that jurisdictional boundaries and the combinations and recombinations of those and forms of governments and various incentives for regional action are generally controlled at the state level. And we need to look at very clearly and tell ourselves the truth about demographics, what's happening to our cities in terms of population shifts and the reasons that they are shifting, and pay particular attention to schools and safety and housing problems. A quick word about Washington, D.C. All of the kinds of things that we've talked about in terms of global issues and issues for city-states here are present here in the nation's capital. Since I've been here, I've seen a lot of talk and thought about what the relationship should be between the district and the federal government. And frankly, not much about what the relationship is between the district and the metropolitan region. That has got to change. What we need to do is to see that the challenge that we have in terms of really functioning as a city-state in the Washington, D.C. area are the similar kinds of jurisdictional problems we've got other places. Not only do we have a federal government, but 2 states and a federal district. And we need to understand that city-states do cross boundaries, not only counties and state boundaries, but in some cases even national boundaries. And all of our major issues require regional solutions. In the District of Columbia, if we're going to have a strong economy, we do have to look at our tax structure. We do have to look at cooperative economic development. We do have to look at the way we're financing infrastructure, not only roads and bridges, but increasingly telecommunications infrastructure. If we're going to have a clean environment in the district, we have to look at regulatory reform. We have to find ways to look at stormwater and other regional environmental issues. If we're going to have social equity as a sustainable city-state, we have to do things in school system reform, and we have to have a regional approach to welfare to work. And if we're going to have civic engagement that's meaningful in the district, we've got to do this in a way that people feel like their voice is heard at the neighborhood and local government level, as well as at the regional level. Since we're at Brookings, I think it only appropriate to close with my favorite philosopher, Wayne Gretzky. He said once, "I don't skate to where the puck is. I skate to where the puck will be." If those of us who care about people and care about cities don't begin to think differently about the places we live and work in and govern, then we are constantly skating to old news. Regionalism and thinking of sustainable city-states is where the puck will be, and I welcome this audience in helping us skate there safely.